Welcome to the podcast, Casey. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, I usually start these podcasts with the same question, which is how did you find your way into fire protection or fire and life safety?
Yes, and I know we're all on a journey. My particular journey goes back to my days in high school. My oldest brother was a firefighter. He was appointed as a career firefighter in our fire department in our suburban town in Massachusetts, where I grew up, and I was basically following in his footsteps, and started once I graduated high school. Simply went to a community college for fire science, and then wasn't sure what to do as I. It was during the 1970s. I'll date myself with that um, that I graduated high school, and getting on some of the fire departments that I was applying to was more challenging in those days because of they were really pushing diversity and some other issues, and all for good reasons at that time. But so I continued going to school, and I applied to several schools, Oklahoma State and University of Maryland, and all of a sudden I got this letter back from University of Maryland saying I've been accepted. And I was like, well, where is that? Wait a minute, what is this all about here? And so I went to the University of Maryland for fire protection engineering, and I was only there for a couple of weeks under the direction of Dr. John Bryan, who I still look upon with a great favor as one of the great people in my life that influenced me. And I realized this is what I want to do: fire protection engineering. And I was living at the time at Hyattsville, Company One in Prince George's County as a live-in firefighter during those early semesters. And so I spent my time at the University of Maryland, got my degree in fire protection engineering, went on to multiple jobs throughout my career. And then also during that time during the 1980s, because I was in the vicinity of Worcester Polytechnic Institute, WPI, I realized, well, wait a minute, I can go nights and get my master's here. So I was one of the early graduates from uh, WPI in the fire protection engineering master's program. And I was the first University of Maryland undergraduate to go through WPI and get a master's in fire protection engineering. So I was the first one living in both worlds. There's many of us today, but I was the number one sort of crossing that bridge over um, between the two schools.
Wow, was that like sacrilegious at the time to make the switch from Maryland to WPI? I mean, now feel like nobody would think twice about it, but I could see back in the day people bristling at that.
That's exactly right, and it was competitive, and there was a lot of sort of finger pointing, each way, um, and yeah, I felt like a pioneer and a bridge builder, and it was great. And today it means nothing. In fact, there is great allegiance in the fire protection engineering schools, not just in the U.S. and North America, but around the world. And I do spend my time as a member of the board of governors for the SFPE Foundation, and the activities and involvement of the schools around the world, literally every corner of the world, is just very impressive today. And I'm glad to be part of that.
That's awesome. That's something that I've remarked on before is that allegiance or that solidarity in fire and life safety is, um, I think it's special. I look at other industries and I don't see that kind of continuity between the different schools and even the professionals. I think that the fact that it is life safety there's something binding about that. So I appreciate you touching on that.
And I'll just reflect that when we have our alumni meetings, which we'll have, next week at the NFPA conference and exposition, uh, I typically attend the University of Maryland alumni dinner and the WPI dinner, and I run from one to the other. And there's great allegiance still, even with the alumni, and it's a great thing. And I encourage any young person who's good at math, this is your career path. It's great to be part of this family.
Yes, I think that's a good point, and yeah, that's something I think our industry, well, that I want to do better for. I shouldn't speak for the industry as a whole, but as advocating to those young minds for math and science. But I appreciate that point. But so I wanted to give the listeners a little bit more context on your background and some of the different roles that you've held, because you have had some really interesting positions in your career so far and still continue to do interesting work today. So I'd love to hear more about that, Casey.
Sure. And yes, I have to admit, I have had some interesting occupations through the years, the biggest portion of which I spent almost 33 years at NFPA, National Fire Protection Association. And that was my primary career spot. But I will say, one of my very first jobs while I was still in school as a summer intern at General Services Administration was among one of the more interesting jobs. Working in the Capital District down in Washington D.C., and I was a summer intern with another student, but we got under the cloak of several other engineers, and we just followed them everywhere on their daily activities, and as a result found our way into fascinating places like the White House or the warehouse for all CIA primary equipment or the underground tunnels that are going all throughout, underneath the mall, for the central heating and cooling plant, and the Library of Congress. I'm looking while we're standing there looking through Thomas Jefferson's material, um, and just all kinds of really interesting things in that short period of time. So it was really, a start of a career path working in different areas where I realized fire protection is part of everything. The loss prevention, life safety, that is key. And as a result, I found as I worked in different occupations, once I graduated school, I went to Fenwal, and I worked there for approximately 5 years in the early 1980s. Fenwal, Kidda, and which has been bought and sold several times over since those early days. But working on halon systems and fire alarm systems, and finding my way into a lot of very interesting facilities that were using those at the time. Um, and explosion suppression systems, per NFPA 68 and 69. So there was a lot of work done in those early days building up the science, and even Fenwal did a lot of testing. But I left there and I went to work in nuclear power and worked for Impel for several years, and worked in nuclear power plants in the mid to late 80s, 1980s. And that was also very fascinating. But I will say, once I went over to NFPA and was a staff liaison starting out there, I worked we were all assigned multiple committees, but the committees I had were heavy industry, primarily power plants, boilers, ovens. These are the NFPA standards addressing all of these topics: wastewater treatment plants, mining. The list goes on and on and on. But we would have our committee meetings, and we would often have tours of the local power plant or the local wastewater treatment plant, or some other fascinating place. And I can tell you, we had meetings on the at Cape Kennedy, and was able to go on the launch pads, and at NORAD, and touring ships and even rail transport. So it's sort of like, where does it begin and end? And so the applications, for those of you who are looking at this career path, it's just fire protection is everywhere. And I will also add, I greatly appreciated while I was at NFPA, I volunteered to travel to give presentations and papers in all parts of the world. And every year I took 3, 4 international trips, and found myself able to visit pretty much every. I've been to every continent except Antarctica. I'd love to get there someday, even though I kind of got close while in Tasmania, but that's as close as I've ever been. Um, but again, fire protection's everywhere, including the space station, and working on activities there. So while at NFPA, I'll just tell you that my career wrapped up. I spent the last 10 years with the Fire Protection Research Foundation, the research affiliate for NFPA. And while there, working on research projects and covering many different topics, and really promoting important research projects. I do want to add one other activity I did while I was at NFPA, before I went to the Research Foundation, was I was the secretary of the NFPA Standards Council, which is, I did that for about 11 years, which is the Supreme Court of the codes and standards making system. And I did that from the early 1990s up through the early 2000s. Um, and um, and that had a lot of responsibility, and that's really working with all NFPA codes and standards. So I became very intimate and familiar with all the documents, the 300 plus NFPA codes and standards, and all the committees. There's approximately 8,000 ish volunteer committee members, and with many are on multiple committees. But anyway, so that was very interesting and important work working with the Standards Council. I do just want to end by saying I retired from NFPA right at the end of 2019, January 1st, 2020. About 3 months later, the entire world retired, it seemed, with the pandemic. And so we were all sort of working from home at that point. I did not want to truly retire, so I did create my own LLC corporation, and for as an independent contractor, and have been working on multiple activities since then, with a lot of focus on certain topics, some of which I had been working on before I left the Research Foundation, like foam, and firefighting foam, or firefighter training with virtual reality and immersive learning. Those are a couple topics I still work on today, as well as battery energy storage systems, LNG plants, and certain other sort of specialized topics.
Man, I apologize. I was taking some notes there. Too many good topics to talk about. I do a lot of work with aircraft hangars, so definitely would be interested in talking with that foam issue with you. But yeah, at first I just wanted to say what great foreshadowing to your career that one of your first roles was running around in DC and seeing a bunch of historic landmarks and monuments. I think that was there's no way you could have known it yet, but the promise of what you would get to experience during your time as a professional, that's pretty awesome. It feels like a storybook moment. Um, and yeah, I just think that's really cool to hear about. And I can't think of a much more compelling way to show people what promise there is in the industry than to hear about those experiences. To me, that was really cool to hear about. So I just wanted to, um, just say that. But that was awesome. Um, Sorry, I just was mooning there for a second. But yeah, it's lots of good stuff you talked about. Your travels are really neat. Man, I can't believe that you're a world traveler and got to see all over and got to travel for those presentations and different things. I'd love to hear just a little bit more about that if you'd like to speak about that. That's really cool.
I'll mention among the most interesting trips outside of North America that I have been involved with, and there were several that I really enjoyed for different reasons. But perhaps the most interesting trip was in the early 1990s, after the first Gulf War, not the second Gulf War, but the first Gulf War, where Iraq invaded Kuwait and really caused a lot of damage and basically took over Kuwait and the U.S. and the world responded and went in and with military force and pushed them back out and pushed them back into deep within Iraq at the time. But there was a lot of destruction and damage. Approximately, it was less than a year, but NFPA worked closely with the Kuwaiti Fire Service Directorate, which is the country fire brigade, fire department, if you will. And under, at the time, former Chief Dave Gratz, who was the international director at NFPA, who had very strong ties throughout the Middle East. And the Kuwaiti Fire Service Directorate had NFPA and NFPA staff come and assist the rebuilding of their fire service and the infrastructure, including certain subcomponents like public education and certain other things that we take for granted in established places. So I was part of the team that went over there and to the destroyed Kuwait City, and so we spent about a month there, and the oil wells were still burning around on the horizon, and destruction was incredible. And and so was even we drove up the highway. They had repaved the main highway back up into Iraq, and so we could drive up there and drive back. And it's the so-called highway of death, if you've ever heard of this, where when the Iraqi forces withdrew, they took every single vehicle they could find. It didn't matter, passenger vehicles, hearses, cement trucks, police cars, fire engines, you name it. Anything with wheels, they got on it and they tried to get out, and they went up the highway and they just destroyed the highway, with the A-10 Warthogs and the other military power coming in, and so literally for miles there was just stretches of equipment, sort of, off to the sides, destroyed. Some military equipment as well, tanks and other things, just there, blown up, and you couldn't. You had to be very careful where you went because there was still a lot of ordnance and live shells and other things. So you didn't go anywhere unless it was clearly designated as safe. So anyway, that was an incredible experience to work with the Kuwaiti Fire Service Directorate. And, I will just add as a footnote here, it was a real eye opener to see firsthand the tragedy of war, and the human wreckage was a painful thought. And yeah, there were places where people were tortured and other issues. So, but this was so that honestly was one of the more remarkable trips that I was involved with. And one of the more remarkable projects was the rebuilding and the reestablishment of the Kuwaiti Fire Service Directorate um, in the early 1990s.
That's incredible. Across the world and in war-torn countries, fire protection in any place that you could imagine. Man, that's pretty cool to hear about. Um, Another thing that you touched on, which I know has been somewhat of a theme for you, is your first role and kind of dealing with gaseous fire suppression. And I know that you played a role in the research and kind of the technology alternatives for gaseous fire suppression later on in your career. I'd love to talk about that because I feel like this trend of technology either coming to fruition or being deprecated or removed from the fire and life safety culture or zeitgeist is something that we're not going to be able to get away from it. So I'd love to hear about that too.
Yes, and I'm going to just start by saying environmental stewardship is a key part of what we do in fire protection, whether we realize it or not. And as we look at our fire protection goals of life safety, property protection, mission continuity, environmental impact is critical. And it really is clear in some of our historical events, like the Dayton paint warehouse fire, which happened almost at the same time as the Sandoz fire on the Rhine River in Switzerland. The so-called Tale of Two Cities, those fires. But environmental stewardship is huge, and it becomes even more important as our planet becomes more and more confining, as we are, we don't have the endless, boundless resources that we had 100 years ago. The we have a finite planet, and dealing with that is important for our current generations and future generations. So that going back with the halon, halon was the wonder gas, halon 1301, and we did a lot of fire protection systems and a lot of work with that. And I was directly involved at the time with Fenwal. But clearly, with the hole in the ozone layer, there was a dramatic environmental wake up call with the Montreal Protocol. And, historically, the Montreal Protocol, when it was signed by the countries that signed onto it, was really an incredible historical moment in terms of countries coming together in acting on an environmental issue before they had the further proof they needed. And this is the precautionary principle of environmental law. And that you take action, just like at a hazmat scene. If there's a concern, you take action until you can prove otherwise. Your default is you've got to do the safe and right thing. And the world did that at the time. And it required us figuring out alternatives for Halon 1301 and banking and carefully monitoring our inventories and so forth. And I'm very proud of the work of the fire protection community at that time, working closely with the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency here in the United States, and all the other similar government organizations around the world through the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, UNEP. And really, the fire protection community rising to the challenge of finding alternatives. Fires were not going away. We have these high value protected hazards, and we still needed to do that. And the same is true today with foam. By the way, you mentioned foam a minute ago. Foam has also been with AFFF like, wow, this is great stuff. Hold on, we've got an environmental problem here. There's the forever chemicals. This is a problem. However, for us in the fire protection world, flammable Class B fires, they're not going away. The fire service and others still have to handle these aircraft hangars or wherever they are. And that is a problem. And so, once again, the fire protection community rising to the challenge to address those alternatives and changes.
I love that framing of the issue. Rise to the challenge. Let's be creative. Let's find alternatives. People can be surly or, want to be stuck in the old ways of, well, we've always done it this way, but it's like, no, there are people who are getting cancers from these things, and it's, hazardous to the environment. We need to be better stewards of the planet and the people these systems are supposed to be protecting. So I appreciate you sharing that note. Yes, the it's been a remarkable thing in my career to see the change from, the where I first saw it hit was the Department of Defense kind of coming out and saying, "Hey, by 2024, we're gonna stop all of these foam installations and AFFF," and so it just everybody reacted so quickly to start finding new listings for devices and researching how we're going to get foam concentrate through different proportioners and the different viscosities, and the fact that there are already people with listed products in 2023 and that information came out. um, it felt like not very long ago at all. It's just pretty cool to me to see that happen. So yeah. But Yeah, I think that you touched on a couple historic fires during your talk about the gaseous suppression, and I know that you have it's hard to not be interested in historic fires in this profession, but I know that you have um, a unique proclivity for being interested in historic fires and truly diving into them and all the factors that we can learn from them. So I wanted to speak with you about your experience with historic fires and the role that you held at NFPA in kind of looking at these from not a cause and origin standpoint as much as from a design perspective of how these buildings failed and what we can learn from these fires.
Yes, and I just want to start. First of all, I will fully admit I love history, but keep in mind, as fire protection engineers and those working in the fire protection community, we prove a lot of what we do through different methods. One is full scale testing, and a lot of empirical activities and research, but another is experience. Experience. The historical record is huge. And we can see the difference when we talk about emerging issues like battery energy storage systems. Like, whoa, how do we deal with these things? Well, we don't have the historical record that we do with buildings and flammable liquids and lots of other things. And we learn a lot. And quite honestly, the huge advancements in the regulatory infrastructure can be traced back to big events, unfortunately, because in the court of public opinion, getting the world to embrace regulatory changes is hard because there is typically trade offs like cost and so forth that have to be dealt with. But when people die, for instance, in large life loss fires, it's a big deal. And people say, we never want that to happen again. I will tell you, my string of writing articles in NFPA Journal on these historical events started because I enjoyed writing articles on different topics like Halon 1301 or whatever it was. But I realized, wow, these are really interesting. I want to write about a historical event. And we were coming up at the time on the 50th anniversary of the Coconut Grove fire. And one thing I learned immediately at NFPA was that what is sort of a folklorish, loose definition of a historical fire, and that is it's beyond litigation of any kind. So it's sort of, you know, and I'm laughing because I started looking at some of these other fires that were maybe a little bit more contemporary and realized, no, 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 there's still activity going on in the legal circles, and it's like, don't even get close to that. If you're going to talk about a historical fire, go back long enough so it's just not an issue with the lawyers and other people. And so that was like, oh, okay, well, the Coconut Grove, and I started with that, and I realized I wanted to tell the story from the standpoint of the people who were there, because at the 50th anniversary, there were still plenty of people around. Today, there's only literally, on one hand, you can count the survivors that are left. They're almost all gone now. And I've been involved with the committee for a memorial that we're finally getting put in at the site. So we track that. But I wrote the story in 1991 at the 50th anniversary, and I told it from the standpoint of 5 different individuals. An employee who was at the Melody Lounge. He was a cash register employee at the bar in the Melody Lounge and survived. A responding firefighter who was one of the first arriving firefighters. Um, uh, and then the doctor at the uh, who was leading the emergency room at Mass General that night, and a patron who was there with his wife and another couple that survived. And then finally, a military Navy officer who was also a Boston firefighter who was during wartime, happened to be there stationed for training purposes as an instructor in the Boston area and responded on the military side. So the story is told from their perspective. And it was a big hit. I ended up doing TV interviews and other things as a result of it at the time, and ended up doing, the History Channel and, um, the Smithsonian Channel and certain other TV shows and different things. And it just led to, oh, these stories are interesting, and I just simply drifted into other topics like the Halifax explosion, the Triangle Shirtwaist fire, which I still will claim has been the one fire that is had the most noteworthy impact in our arena among all the others. It is number one. Um, but then I realized I can write about some stories like the Wayside Inn fire and really highlight the cultural resource documents at NFPA, which are quite fascinating. Um, those standards, or in the case of the New London explosion in Texas, where all the children died in the school, pointing out NFPA 58 and some of the gas code documents, which were applicable at the time, or ship fires, the SS Noronic in Toronto Harbor, a large life loss fire, and I use that to highlight again the sidebar NFPA 301 and merchant vessels. So I was using it as a way to tell stories and really underpin these NFPA codes and standards that were directly applicable today in our regulatory infrastructure.
That's really cool to hear about so much. First of all, I think I find it funny that, or I, yeah, I find it funny that when you got too close to the more contemporary fires, that people were getting squeamish around it, because I could definitely see that. Or there was the bridge collapse recently, and there were structural engineers I saw on LinkedIn talking about the gas tanker truck under their bridge. But or these things happen, like the Notre Dame fire that was such a tragedy. I guess that was 3 or 4 years now ago. But yeah, I love the idea of thinking about these, trying to put these historic fire lenses on the new ones. But as you can see with the Grenfell towers, that they're still in the process of litigating that, and that shaking out. I keep seeing grumblings about that, or people who do whole podcasts on the litigation on that. So it takes, I mean, it could take a decade for those or more for those things to shake out. So that was one thing I resonated with in your talking about that. But that's really cool that you got to be a part of they were interviewing you on TV and the History Channel and the Smithsonian Channel. Yeah, I can't imagine. That must be kind of surreal to be just somebody who is interested in fire protection and doing what you love, and then people are like, "Hey, come talk on the History Channel."
Yeah, yeah, those the interviews were always fun, um, and occasionally they weren't always friendly. Most of the time, the historical fires were always friendly, but being interviewed after the station nightclub fire, for instance, I think I did 80 something interviews in the 2 weeks after that fire. And some of them were not friendly. I mean, they, were very attacking on the fire protection community, and, which basically was blunt in terms of, well, why wasn't it sprinklered? Can't we just make everybody have sprinklers? And why can't you make everybody have sprinklers? And it's sort of like, that's not how the world works.
That's funny. People touching a topic that is severely complex and nuanced, and there's all kind of societal constructs involved of, what level of risk is acceptable, and
You know?
you know, existing in new construction. And it's like, you really want me? I know you want a soundbite right now for the news, but it's a very deep topic.
Indeed, absolutely.
But yeah, so one thing I was thinking about when kind of reading some different things that you had written and just talked about for the historic fires is, I know every fire is different, and you posted or you spoke just a second ago about how in some of your writings you'd like to highlight the different resources that NFPA has, but which I think is a great point, because NFPA has so many resources. But when you're looking at a historic fire, is there anything specifically you key in on? And yeah, just trying to illustrate a framework, if there is one at all, for the listeners and for myself selfishly, for when I'm reading these, because I'm not as much of a history buff.
Yeah, well, let me just start by saying at every fire, historical or contemporary, there's a folklorish uh, understanding in the fire service that when the public people come up to you on the street, they always ask two questions. Always. And it's just striking how often I hear this. Anybody hurt? How did it start? Anybody hurt? How did it start? So that's like, for some reason, this is what blurts out of people, the layperson at any and every event, including historical fires. But, it's sort of like, well, wait a minute. Even at the Coconut Grove, it could have started a number of different ways. And, this has been high postulation through the years regarding the origin. But the official causes in the Boston Fire Department official report is unknown because they could not prove the faulty electrical wiring and all this other stuff. And it was just like, wait a minute, there was fanfare about a busboys match, but it's like, look, that's not the issue here. Because even during wartime, sabotage, arson, why did this fire spread the way it did? Why did it burn the way it did? Those are the underlying questions that really concern us. And I will say, for historical fires, we continually go back to and this is what the media always asks for when they call on the 100th anniversary or 50th anniversary of an event. What have we learned? What have we changed? What have we progressed with today? And tell us, how did these people who died not die in vain? What have we done here? And they want to know, they want to see that yardstick of improvement in our world, that we have made a safer world and a better world over time, and we're doing something constructive about that. And that's where you go back to these earlier events. We want to know what has changed in the regulatory infrastructure. What have we done to make sure not only that event hasn't happened, but over the years, arguably saving hundreds, thousands of lives, injury, property loss? We want to make sure we're minimizing all of that. And so that's what we really focus on. And let me just say, from the fire protection standpoint, there's hazards all around us. Some are more inbred or inherent, or low key, but they're everywhere, whether it's flammable liquids or whatever the case may be, and building fires, so forth. What are we protecting as a hazard, and what are we trying to accomplish? And that's key as we go forward in our fire protection engineering roles.
Definitely, yeah. I think that's a good point. It's always definitely, I can think of a fire locally here recently where those two questions were the first things out of people's mouth: is how did it start, and did you hear that, or do you remember that? It's first, did it even cross your radar, and then second, how did it start? And so, yeah, looking at um, the post-mortem of the fire, or just the report from the fire service. And yeah, that's funny that you state that. And then, yeah, thinking about stuff like um, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, or looking at a historic fire specifically, and then being able to state what specifically we changed in the code is seems like an impactful way to communicate with people. How society changed because of that. And so that's a good point to focus in on those locations, because hey, we found these so egregious that we changed the way that the building code works. So that's a
Yeah.
good point. But yeah, I was reading about, I forget which historic fire, but you were talking about the flame spread and the fuel loading and different kind of unique factors for the um, like drapings on the walls and ceilings, and kind of analyzing those factors specifically, or talking about the rapidity of the fire spread and how it was not as intense, but the fastness of the fire was the kind of interesting fact. But um, yeah, if you would speak about how you look at those factors, because that was very interesting to me and not intuitive to me as somebody who deals with the built environment, but is not looking at fires as much, historic fires as much. So I thought that was really neat.
Quite honestly, I will say that I've had a presentation for several years now, and I've given it at SFPE and NFPA multiple times on our efforts to provide fire modeling on the historical event of the Coconut Grove fire. And the challenge here is we are lacking a lot of key inputs. And, here we are, we're, approaching not too distant. We'll be at the century mark for this event. It's 80 plus years. But so we're really lacking things that we wish we had. But we do have a fair amount of information. So what we did was I worked with Professor Nick Dempsey and presented this for 3 separate years. Then we retired it because of what we'll call student assignment fatigue, where it's like, no, they just share stuff, and we got to just let this thing sit. But we shared the event. I would give presentations to the fire modeling class, and they applied the fire models back at those years. This was 2015 ish, around that time frame, and we had them evaluated as best they could. And it was fascinating because, in that case, and it's still a mystery of how that fire burned the way it did, because it defies the logic of the fire models that we have today, which are continually improving. And yes, we're lacking enormous inputs that we really need to be more accurate. But even in a general rough sense, it's like, wow, this was an incredibly, remarkably fast fire. And in some ways, similar to the station nightclub, which is a more contemporary comparison, which is highly documented with the video, which is just a remarkable historical record that allows us to go back and compare the fire models, like what we see with the station nightclub. And we had the materials left over that were able to be tested and so forth. So we have very strong inputs for the station nightclub and can really see what we're doing with the models. We don't have the same with the Coconut Grove, despite some similarities of the event. But it's sort of like, wait a minute, the station nightclub, a very ferocious, intense heat release fire, consumed everything there, as we would expect, and the fire models show. So the intensity of that was dramatic. Well, the Coconut Grove, half the people in that building that night died. And for those who didn't die, half of the remaining were injured. So you had a 1 in 4 chance of getting out of that building that night, which are incredibly low odds for any and every disaster in a building. And yet that fire flashed through there and it didn't consume things. It was not the same kind of ferocious fire. It was a flash fire by comparison. And it's like, yeah, wait a minute, what was fueling this? And so to this day, it's still a mystery on the fire protection engineering side.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I appreciate that extra exposition on the fire modeling and the different factors involved. Um, I wanted to speak to you about the research roadmap for smart firefighting because I saw in that you had said that it was one of your favorite projects that you had worked on in your career, and that I think that it is very timely. Yes, that's a great show of it, and it's very timely because everybody's talking about AI now and how to use big data sets and how to be more intelligent about technology and in everything that we do. So yeah, I just would like to hear more about that from you.
First, let me just say for everyone who's listening or watching, This is NIST Special Publication 1191. So you can just go simply look it up and download it or look at it. Published in 2015. And it was a project we worked on with NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, Gaithersburg, Maryland. And it is a seminal work. It is a milestone landmark document. And I'm very proud of being the editor in chief of this publication and among the other authors. And we had quite a lineup of authors contribute to this. And so at that time, we were really sort of like, wow, we're entering a new era here. And we really are today, as we went from the industrial age to the digital age to arguably the cyber physical systems age, where it's a combining of the physical and the cyber worlds. And and clearly, this has impact on the fire protection community and the emergency response community. And the one thing I will say, and we see this, and I actually pulled up one of my other publications in the SFP um, membership publication, where I wrote an article in 2019 about, well, where have we come, and, since the roadmap was published, and yes, we have seen progress. We're living it all the time, so we don't necessarily appreciate how we're advancing because we're in it. You can't see the forest because of the trees. And I will say there's some components of this, like AI, artificial intelligence, that are dramatic in terms of their influence and impact. And AI, just in the simplest of terms for everybody, is, computers have great abilities and strengths, but they also have weaknesses. They can do massive, numerous calculations in fractions of seconds that we cannot do as with our human brains. But our human brains can do things a computer can't do, like pick out a face in a crowd, or voice recognition, and some of these very other subtle things that over hundreds of thousands, millions of years, whatever, have evolved for us. The computer cannot do those until you start introducing AI. And now the computer can start doing things like a human can do. And like when you go in, you can see how it can generate minutes of meetings for you, and do some very fascinating things and really think. And that's dramatic. And so this is having a great influence in terms of a lot of things we'll do. And I'll just give you one or two very short examples. Um, we talk about virtual reality, for instance, as one of the mechanisms of doing different things. And I'm working on a project for the fire service and training right now with the North America Fire Training Directors with immersive learning. And it offers it's got drawbacks, but it's got great advantages, such as you can have massive drills like the military does, and do some things that you just can't do otherwise. But one of the things that we see is we are using virtual reality and augmented reality already in the fire service, clearly, with heads up displays on our SCBA face pieces, with the United Nations disaster response work that they have, and this is happening on the wildland front with virtual operation support teams and virtual operation support groups. What are they? Well, they're virtually volunteers, like almost you could consider them like volunteer firefighters in a way, but they're people sitting at their computers anywhere they happen to be, not at the incident, who are feeding back social media information, and it's being brought to the incident command. And this has been used at, for instance, wildfires like the Fort McMurray fire several years ago in Canada, where they had to evacuate neighborhoods multiple times to different spots and re-evacuate them. And they used the virtual operation support team to find out what's going on over here. Somebody send us, clips from Facebook and these, feeds. And they had that organized enough at that time, even, that they were doing that effectively. And this has been further codified and organized So you have these virtual operation support team supporting incident command on large events today. So we're back to the things that we're leveraging and manipulating, and they're happening today as we speak. We don't necessarily appreciate these things, but it's there and it's happening and it's very powerful.
Yeah, I appreciate you pulling examples of how those AR and VR are used in society because I think that it's easy just to be high-minded and kind of talk about these things in a just a conceptual basis, but and yeah, so I appreciate the concrete examples of how these things are diffusing into society and continuing to gain momentum. I think it's something that we're only going to see more of as far as augmented reality, especially for it seems like a just a huge game changer for the fire service as far as if we can build some of these fire and life safety factors into some way for the fire service to see with their augmented reality, but lots of neat opportunities. So I'm glad that you are um, pursuing those in your research, and just sounds like you've been looking at it since for a while, but with the research roadmap. But yeah, I can. It seems like so much has changed from 2015 till now. And even when you wrote that research, I can't believe how ahead of its time all that and how good of a document still today the research roadmap is for anybody who's thinking about how can we use AI in fire and life safety. There's a lot of talk about data and sensors, which is kind of the background for um, AI and machine learning. Is you need very large data sets. So I think that's a very well covered topic and a good topic if people are interested in new technology approaches and they want some good available content for like stirring those kind of thoughts. Um, I was using it for that recently, going back and reading and prepping for this interview. But it's a topic that we talk about in the office all the time because you can't get away from it. Nobody can get away from it. Every industry you can think of is talking about it. So I think it's. I'll put a link to it in the show notes, but for people who want to go check it out. But yeah, it's very interesting. But yeah, I wanted to talk more about that, like the sensors and the data piece of it. But yeah, I'd like to, if you have more exposition on that for the listeners who haven't taken a look at this document or might like some overview of it, that'd be cool to hear about.
I will just really summarize it here. This is the Cliff Note version of look, we are in a data rich world today, and it is increasing in its richness at an incredible rate. And we are harvesting data at just phenomenal ways that we never had before. So the question is, what do we do with this? And I do want to just step back and during presentations, even back earlier in 2015, we realized, and there was a saying then, it's been kind of worn out arguably, that data is the new oil. And part of it is that it's a commodity. And we would clearly show the market capitalization trends of how market capitalization, and for the big organizations, the huge world organizations and the corporate environment, the data organizations, Microsoft, Google, Apple, and so forth, they have replaced the oil companies on those charts. And they are dwarfing everybody else in their magnitude. And data is indeed the new oil. So the question is, well, wait a minute, what's happening with all this data? And let me just also say, data is like lifeblood. It's a tricky thing. You don't just like get it in buckets and then run around with it. There's a lot of non-technical issues with the data, like confidentiality and lots of other issues, legal issues. So that complicates things. But the bottom line, you step back and strip everything else away, it's all about these three things. You've got to collect the data, you've got to process the data, and then you've got to deliver the data. That's it. You got to capture it, process it, and deliver it. Now, capturing it, I'm back to the data rich world we live in. We are being flooded with data coming in at us from everywhere. I was just talking about virtual operation support teams harvesting data from social media. And I can tell you that even, Google and others see the traffic when there's a wildfire, and they're actually going in searching on keywords, and they're getting maps of wildfire. And again, you can run with this with artificial intelligence and so forth, and it's as accurate as what satellite maps are showing,
Wow.
based on input from people. So we're finding clever, unique ways to harvest this information and then do something with it. But as we go forward, you got to do something with this data. You got to process it. In some cases, that's very straightforward and just comparing data sets or something. But in other cases, you got to do fire modeling or something much more complex, perhaps. Whatever the application. But then at the end of the day, and arguably the biggest misstep and the biggest gap is delivering the data to who needs it, the way they need it, when they need it, and nothing more. Because this is where we're at great fault all the time, is overloading people with data that is meaningless. It's like, well, what is this? And just like a fighter aircraft pilot, you've got to ergonomically get that zoned in. So, and especially with cases on a fire ground, which we used to love as an example because you have pre-event, post-event, we have a lot more time. On the fire ground, you don't have a lot of time. And let me just say, another case study event was the shooting in Las Vegas at the hotel several years back, which was a high life loss event. But any active shooter situation, you are trying to process critical information in short time frames. And I will pick on this one event because it was a high rise, ultra modern casino bristling with unbelievable electronics and data inputs. Where was that data going? It was not getting to the people who needed it, when they need it, the way they need it, and nothing more. So that the emergency responders, the law enforcement people particularly, were able to zero in and clarify it's a single shooter from this location, even though the ventilation systems with the broken windows were telling them that that's where the broken windows are. Well, that kind of information has got to get back to who needs it, when they need it, and nothing more, so that proper decisions can be made. But that gets us back to defining the fire ground and the event itself and doing a lot of other background pieces. But that's happening. And so this is where we're evolving with this, and it's heading in the right direction.
I like that. That's a good point. I like that you have simplified it because I think people get overwhelmed with just the term AI is so jargony and so it's becoming a useless phrase. I think that not useless in application, but just in describing or letting people know what it is. People are hearing AI and machine learning so much, they'll misattribute it. So, um, but yeah, I want to ask you one more question if you have time. But if you don't, if you have a meeting or anything, you can let me know. We can end now. It's been wonderful, but I'd like to get to the last question I had, which is what opportunities do you see for AI and fire safety? Because I think that we've touched on a lot of good points for kind of where we're seeing it pop up, but I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Certainly. And I'll go right back to the research roadmap on smart firefighting, to how to subdivide all this, because it's very broad. There's endless applications for us all here. And I even mentioned some of that with, for a fire event, you certainly have the time frames of during the event, but there's a lot that happens pre-event, of course. And even there, I will just say quickly, examples being, we have our built-in fire protection systems, but there's inspection, testing, and maintenance. And how do we automate that and make sure that things are absolutely ready to go on game day? And we have a lot of sort of laborious ITM, inspection, testing, and maintenance procedures. Well, can we automate all this? And how do we fine tune all that? And we're being able to do that. And we have research projects looking at that, quite honestly. And even post event forensics and a lot of other things happening after event when you have, again, more time than during the event. So the research roadmap subdivides a lot of this and makes it much more manageable. But AI has great ability, and honestly, and I'll just throw out a couple of examples because it's like, where does your imagination want to go with this? And I'll tell you, there's a whole world of people doing unbelievable applications in other arenas. We look at that and say, wait a minute, we want to do that for us. We want to do that for and I'll give a couple of clear examples. Fire marshals. We did a project where we said, we see crowd counting going on here, and they're using the same visual image recognition techniques that are used for autonomous vehicles today, where it can recognize a stop sign or things as it goes down the road, the vehicle. But it's like, we want to count people in a crowd. And so we worked on this project, and it's since been completed. And I'm not sure where it ended up because I retired. But that whole thing was based so that fire marshals and others can realistically, automatically, with CCTV cameras and whatever, have count numbers and realize, especially as we look at fire evacuation models, that we're going to have a problem, arguably. So part of this is trying to relate it back to our other tools so that we could have a potential crowd crush event here. Heads up, red alert, whatever. So that was one application. Another one that I found fascinating was a project at the University of New Mexico where they were looking at the cyber firefighter of the future, but they were using AI and other approaches to evaluate, for instance, radio traffic and picking out if they heard that word Mayday, having certain things automatically happen, you know, for a lot of different things. So without the clutter of like, who said that? What's happening? And really trying to automate certain things on certain key phrases in the radio traffic. Or another one, they were measuring the breathing rates of individual firefighters. And there's a lot of physiology activity going on here with firefighters and the sensors and what do we do with this information. But you can actually detect, based on the breathing rates and established baselines, other issues like this firefighter is going to be going into a real problem here and they're running out of air, and we can measure that. And so really evaluating these key feedbacks to make important fire ground decisions for others or the person involved.
That's a great couple examples there, and a beautiful place to end. Casey, I just want to say, if you don't have anything else to share with the community, thank you so much for coming on the show, and it's been a very fascinating talk. But yeah, if you'd have anything like that you would like to promote or speak about to close out the interview, please do. But otherwise, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And I just want to say, for anyone considering the career path of fire protection engineering, I can't say enough about that, and would encourage them. And if you know somebody, certainly support the profession and all the great work that we do.